Welcome. We're delighted to have you here. Today we have a presentation that I'm really excited about on a range of issues related to school safety. One of the things I wanted to mention is that Chris Vargas, who was really the sponsor for this presentation, apologizes for not being able to be here because she is at a all-day university P&T committee meeting. She had to attend it. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our four presenters. They're going to present, and then we are hopeful that you guys will have some questions and we can have some conversation once they finish their presentation. And are you presenting in the order that you're there? They'll say who they are when they're there. But Holly Floyd over here, Wynn Wellens, Stephanie Wilkins, and Sneha P. I can't pronounce Sneha's last name.
It's difficult. I get it.
I'm turning it over to you guys.
Good afternoon. We wanted to go ahead and point out that if you didn't get a chance to sign in, we would love for you guys to go ahead and do that. And we also have a range of handouts over there as well that we'll refer to throughout the presentation. And before we begin, we also wanted to make a disclaimer that this presentation does discuss some topics related to school violence. So if at any point you do need to get up and take a break, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, we'll have time for some questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sneha. Okay.
Thanks, Holly. All right. School shooting. So for the purpose of this presentation, we have certain inclusionary factors, just so that we are clear what we consider as school shooting. And so the first point is school shooting must involve at least one person being shot, not including the shooter. The shooting must occur on school property, which includes but is not limited to buildings, athletic fields, parking lots, stadiums, and buses. We also included accidental shooting, as long as the first two parameters are met. And we also included injuries sustained from BB guns, because it is considered as potentially lethal. So across the entire US history, there have been like 5 major school shootings that happened, starting with Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and Santa Fe. So first one being Columbine High School. This incident happened in 1999, which resulted in 15 deaths and 24 got injured. The aftermath of Columbine incident was that there was massive debate on gun laws. Many schools across America enacted zero tolerance policies and rules regarding disruptive behaviors and threats of violence from students. And then lawsuits were filed against the school and the police. The legal and ethical implication was that former President Bill Clinton set 3 priorities on gun violence control. First being child safety locks on new handguns, ban on the importation of high-capacity ammunition and magazines, and regulation of handgun sales at traveling gun shows. So 10 years after this particular incident happened, an article was published by Addington titled "School Security Measures Used by Public Schools After Columbine." And this study did a survey on school security measures used by public schools in various states in US. So in New Jersey, they started implementing iris recognition software to limit access to school. Mississippi was the first in the United States to install internet-based cameras or webcams. California installed radio frequency identification tags on identification badges to track students' attendance, as well as to prevent vandalism in bathrooms. And some of the other school security measures were limiting access to school building, limiting weapons on campus, increasing surveillance of students, reacting to a crisis or violent incident like student drills, and other kind of things, which Holly would be talking about in some time. So second incident was Virginia Tech. This happened in 2007, which resulted in 33 deaths and 17 got injured from the gunfire. And at this time, it was considered as one of the deadliest shootings carried out by a single gunman in the US history. The aftermath was that United States Department of Education filed a suit against Virginia Tech for violation of CLERI Act. Now we do get this email stating CLERI Act. So basically CLERI Act requires universities to issue timely warnings to students following an incident that could pose a threat or harm to their safety. So Virginia Tech did not do that. They did not notify students of initial shootings. And another reason for the lawsuit filed was that the school's lack of and delay in recognizing the perpetrators' warning signs. Internationally, this also had like a big impact. Two European universities, University of Darmstadt in Germany and Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, started creating their first threat assessment program for students and faculty called as TAM, Threat Assessment and Management Program. So the legal and ethical implication was that, again, there was a worldwide criticism against US gun culture. There was a serious debates on gun violence, gun laws, school shooting, mental health. The former president, George Bush, signed a law strengthening the NICS, which is National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which prohibits the purchase of guns and arms by people with unstable mental background. And National Rifle Association also supported this law. 1 year after this incident, there was another article published titled Connecting the Dots, Lessons from the Virginia Tech Shootings. And in this article, 200 individuals who were directly related to the perpetrators were interviewed. And 3 main concerns were raised which came from this article, which was related to public mental health care, gun laws, and mental health services. With respect to public mental health care, according to Davis, it is entirely inadequate and underfunded in many states. There are many loopholes in gun acquisition laws. There is inconsistency among federal and state laws. There's also incomplete information in the Central Criminal Records Exchange. 28 states do not enter the names of any mentally ill persons in the Federal Register that gun dealers must check before selling a gun. Also, guns can be purchased easily from private persons without a background check. And in terms of mental health services, there is again a gap in recognizing services, the IEP services offered at school and the lack of it in the colleges. The third incident was Sandy Hook, happened in 2012, which resulted in 28 deaths and 2 non-fatal injuries. And at that time, it was considered as the 4th deadliest shooting carried out by a single gunman in the US history. The aftermath was President Obama gave a televised address and emphasized the need for gun control. We the People petition was signed by 100,000 Americans in support of renewed gun debates on gun control. And Americans for Responsible Solutions was launched to raise money for gun control, efforts to counter the influence of powerful pro-gun groups such as NRA. The legal and ethical implication was that President Obama made gun control a central issue in his second term. He signed a proposal that stated 23 executive orders regarding gun control, and the important ones being universal background checks on the purchase of firearms, limiting the magazine capacity to 10 cartridges, ban on assault weapons. And states like New York, Connecticut, and Maryland immediately started enacting restrictions and bans on certain guns. Fourth one happened recently in Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Happened in 2018, resulted in 17 deaths and more than a dozen injuries. And the perpetrator was formally charged with 17 counts of first-degree murder. This again reignited an intense national debate over gun control and mental health. Students' walkout started in support of gun control. Student survivors started putting pressure on lawmakers allied with the NRA to support taking actions on gun violence. Florida legislation came in response to shooting, and then there was this bipartisan support, and 5 points were raised. First being to raise the minimum age for purchasing firearms from 18 to 21, to impose a 3-day waiting period for most purchase of long guns, to ban bump stocks. Now bump stocks are those that converts normal gun into a semi-automatic gun. So banning bump stocks. Fourth one was to create voluntary training program to arm teachers and allow trained school employees to carry concealed handguns on school campuses. Fifth one was to allocate $69 million for mental health programs in the school. And also March for Our Lives movement was launched, which is a student-led demonstration in support of stronger gun violence prevention measures. In the same year, that is 2018, another major school shooting happened, which happened in Santa Fe. This resulted in 10 deaths and 13 were wounded. So the aftermath was there were lawsuits filed, but this time it was filed against the perpetrator's family on the grounds of negligence in securing the weapon, not providing mental health and counseling support, and the failure in warning the public of the perpetrator's possibilities of risky behavior. School's response was that they installed metal detectors at every entrance. Community's response was weaker than the ones that we saw for the Parkland. Here, Santa Fe community largely declined media attention and did not support political gun control actions. So despite all the legal and ethical implications, despite taking all the measures regarding school safety, there were 55 school shootings that happened in US, of which 9 were accidental shootings, 37% were resulted in 1 or 2 deaths or more deaths, and then the remaining percent were resulted in a lot of injuries. Okay, so I'm handing it over to Stephanie, and she would talk about gun violence and research and statistics.
So Art Kellerman is a researcher who looked into gun violence. So in 1993, Art Kellerman and his colleagues published a study about how owning a gun can increase homicide in the household. And of course, the study was funded by the CDC's National Center for Injury Prevention, but as a result, in 1996, the pro-gun members of Congress were outraged and they tried to defund the center of the CDC. So the House of Representatives eliminated $2.6 million, which was the same exact amount of money that this center used in the previous year to research injuries from gun violence. But instead, this funding was now earmarked to only be used for traumatic brain injury. So this, of course, caused firearm injury research to lose a lot of support. And the Dickey Amendment is this wording at the bottom where they said none of the funds the CDC receives can be used to advocate or promote for gun control. Well, of course, no one knows what exactly this means. If you do a study, are you necessarily promoting gun control? So since no one wanted to lose their jobs, of course, or their funding for the research, gun support was essentially silenced and there was less gun research. In 2013, Kellerman then wrote this article called Silencing the Science on Gun Research, pretty much to bring awareness to how this ban is terrible and we can't get good research about preventing gun violence. And even today, the CDC's website does not really have that many links about how to prevent gun violence. In 2013, like Sneha said earlier, Obama had this national plan where he pretty much allowed the CDC to start researching gun violence and gun prevention research. And one important thing to bring up is that most of the research about Gun violence is more specific about how the factors could lead to someone to convict violent acts instead of how limiting gun access can prevent the occurrence and outcomes of violent gun shootings. And then another important personal story is I'm taking a meta-analysis class this semester, and I was interested from this presentation. I wanted to do a meta-analysis about gun prevention, the policies around it. And since the class is only a semester long, the professor said the easiest thing to do is to find a meta-analysis and then try to replicate it and then maybe extend it if you find more studies. But I couldn't really find any meta-analysis about gun research prevention. I had to change topics. That made me sad.
Unfortunate. That's unfortunate.
And an important thing Art Kellerman brought up in his article that since the gun research ban began in '97 and ended in 2013, at least 427,000 people in the U.S. have died from gunshot wounds, while only in the same time span, 4,586 Americans have died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this begs the question, when should Second Amendment rights trump First Amendment rights of freedom to science and research? And an important quote from his article that I liked is, over this 20 years during the gun research ban, the amount of Americans dying from car crashes decreased by 31%, the amount of deaths from fires was 38%, the amount of deaths from drownings decreased by 52%, and this was done without banning cars or pools or matches. Instead, it comes from translating research into effective interventions. So the RAND Corporation is a nonprofit institute where they hope to improve policy decision making through research and analysis. They research areas such as health and education and national security. So I put some quick charts to look at their findings from this report. And child access prevention laws do have some support and evidence for decreasing firearm self-injuries and for decreasing unintentional firearm injuries and deaths. An important thing to note about child access prevention laws is it really depends on how each individual state defines a minor. So in most states, it is 18, but in some states, a minor is someone who's 17, 16, and it can go even as low as 14 in 4 states. And then here, there's less conclusive evidence about minimum age laws for purchasing firearms. So this was a study. One important thing to note is proponents of gun access, they say, well, we should just limit people with mental health problems from getting guns and then there will be less problems. But this study done in 2019 looked at 663 young adults to find an association between gun violence and mental health. And what they noticed is a majority of mental health symptoms are not related to gun violence. Instead, if you have access to guns, people with access to guns are 18 times more likely to have threatened someone with a gun. And individuals with high hostility are about 3.5 times more likely to threaten someone with a gun. So it's more having access to guns instead of having mental health symptoms. That's more important. So since we're in Georgia, here's a quick review of some gun laws. So in Georgia, minors can legally carry a gun if they're attending a hunter or firearm safety class, they're at a target range, they participate in some kind of gun competition, or with their parents' consent, they can use it on their property and apply for a hunting license. Some quick facts about Georgia's concealed carry weapons permit is that you have to be at least 21 to apply for it, but if you're 18 to 21 and in the military, then you can apply for it as well. With this license, you're allowed to keep your gun in your vehicle, and you can carry a gun in state parks. So some places where you can't have a gun, even with this permit, of course, are school buses, school functions, school safety zones, and a school safety zone is pretty much 1,000 feet within a school property. And even if you have the permit and you bring a gun within 1,000 feet, you can be convicted of a felony. And then some places guns are allowed with this permit are state parks, forests, and in your vehicle. So in 2017, Georgia repealed its law prohibiting guns on campus, so now with this permit, you can have a gun on college campuses. But some notable exclusions, of course, are you can't have a gun during sporting events and dormitories, or especially preschools or daycare centers in a campus, and in classrooms which are used for high school students to attend college to get dual enrollment credits. So I looked up which the gun policies for K through 12 schools, and it looks like it differs by state. So depending on the permit, in 19 states, anyone with permission can have it. In some states, it's the employees. 21 states, it's only school security who can have a gun. And then Hawaii doesn't have relevant status. And then, so Georgia law prohibits carrying a gun even with a permit. And K through 12 school safety zones, but a few notable exceptions to that include if a gun is being used in a classroom by a teacher, participating in organized sporting events, and if someone gets written permission from a school board. And now I'll turn it over to Wynn to talk about the legal and ethical implications of arming teachers.
Thanks, Stephanie. So at this time, we're going to go into looking more at legal ethical implications in the schools. We'll talk a little bit about zero tolerance policies and the impact of zero tolerance policies, and then we'll dive more deeply into threat assessment. So one of the implications that came out of the Parkland tragedy was the reignition of the idea of arming educators. So in reaction to Parkland, our current administration proposed several things. One is arming teachers. Then they proposed using federal funds to support firearms training for school personnel. Also awarding bonuses for teachers who elect to carry guns. And then finally allowing teachers who are military veterans to also be able to carry guns on school campuses. So, you know, these proposals were reactions to gun-related violence, and it's really important for us to consider the risk and the rationale when guns are proposed to be more prevalent in the schools. The first consideration is thinking about potential school shootings. I know earlier Sinead had alluded to 9 accidental shootings that had already occurred in the U.S. across different states. The second consideration is that, you know, teachers who are not very comfortable with the idea of arming feel that this is really not their cup of tea. They are teachers who are trained to really teach students in the schools. They're not really comfortable at the idea of having to require to provide the protective layer that is really part of law enforcement, and that they don't feel like they are really trained to shoot. You know, we also, on the flip side, we also have proponents who feel that, you know, it's important that we train teachers to be able to provide protection, because some school districts may not have the funding to afford SROs or school resource officers. And then we also have school districts who are facing lengthy police response time, and so they feel that it's also important to have other school personnel to respond to crisis situations on the spot. So here we have 2 video clips that we'd like to share with you at the end of the presentation, if we have time, showing two different views on arming teachers. Now, the debate about arming teachers reminds us that schools are supposed to be free of guns. In fact, in 1994, the federal government passed the Gun-Free Schools Act in response to the prevalent accessibility of weapons across the country. The GFSA requires LEAs to expel at least 1 year any student who brings a weapon to school and to develop policies requiring referrals of these students to the juvenile delinquency system. Because of this requirement, school districts across the U.S. adopted the zero tolerance weapons policies. And the zero tolerance policies really is about imposing very strict punishment for infractions regardless of the student's culpability, the student's circumstance or context, or looking at the history of the student. Typically, the predetermined punishment, whether it's mild or severe, is always meted out. Now, the goals of zero tolerance were to, of course, serve as a deterrent, to reduce weapon possession on school grounds, and obviously to reduce school violence. Nonetheless, findings from this particular study, Mongan and Walker in 2012, found that there was really, between 1993 and 1999, there was really a very small decline in one demographic group rather than across student populations. They also found that there was actually an increase in student threats and student injuries in the schools. And then finally, they were unable to really establish any clear patterns of school homicide rates due to fluctuations in rates from year to year. Sneha mentioned earlier Columbine. So in 1999, when our country was hit with the Columbine massacre, a wave of fear followed, resulting in the expansion of zero tolerance policies, and at which time suspensions were issued to students who were found with toy guns, nail clippers, or even making gestures simulating shooting, and so forth. And these are just some examples of the zero tolerance approach taken too far. In his commentary, Dr. Dewey Cornell from the University of Virginia reaffirmed what we already suspected, is that these acts of violence and the intense media attention that follow have given the American public the misperception that schools are dangerous places. The sensationalized headlines and the constant replaying of the mass shootings bias our understanding of how likely it is that a school will have a shooting. Schools, in fact, are still one of the safest places in the U.S. In a 37-state sample of over 18,000 homicides recorded by the FBI, less than 0.3% of the total number of homicides took place in the schools, compared to the majority of homicides taking place in the homes and in various public places. Further, the overuse of suspension has resulted in racial disparities in suspension rates among Black and Latinx students. Studies also show that zero tolerance practices are counterproductive, and they actually fail to improve student behavior. Instead, they tend to increase school failure and lower graduation rates. Because these practices contribute to the development of juvenile behaviors, critics consider this process as the school-to-prison pipeline. All right, so now we're going to get a little bit into the threat assessment. Based on the negative outcomes of zero tolerance policies and results from multiple studies of school shootings, the FBI and the Secret Service recommended that schools replace zero tolerance practices with threat assessment. And for those of you who are not familiar, threat assessment is a preventative strategy that allows schools to distinguish low-risk threats from more serious ones. And you may wonder, well, how is threat assessment different from the zero tolerance approach? Well, for one thing, it offers a more flexible alternative to to zero tolerance in that it considers the context and the intent behind student threats. It also distinguishes different types of threats and emphasizes the investigation and resolution of threats to prevent violence. And then finally, it provides follow-up support for that student through mental health evaluations, also provides support services for students who are in need of them. And then it also emphasizes that school personnel maintain contact and to continue to monitor students' progress thereafter. Now, school violence can be prevented, but many times school personnel have no specific guidelines when dealing with students who make threats to harm. After several years of research and pilot studies, Dr. Dewey Cornell and his team from the University of Virginia developed the Virginia Student Threat Assessment Guidelines, known as the VSTAG, in 2001. The Virginia guidelines are recognized as evidence-based practice and are widely implemented across the US and Canada. Now, part of the threat assessment process is having some basic concepts, such as defining what is a threat. And so a threat is defined as an expression of intent to harm someone. The threat may be spoken, written, or gestured. Threats may be direct or indirect, and they are not always necessarily communicated to the intended victim or victims. Weapon possession is presumed to be a threat unless circumstances clearly indicate otherwise. So, for example, if Monday morning comes and a student finds a pocket knife in a backpack of a student, of that particular student, and it turns out that that student had gone camping over the weekend and he or she just forgot to take it out of the backpack. So for that particular situation, a threat assessment would not be appropriate. And then finally, the VSTAG emphasizes that when in doubt, and it's not really clear whether it's a threat or not, you always want to assume that it's a threat, and then you follow procedures to investigate further. Dr. Cornell also offers some understanding about threat characteristics, and you may be surprised to find that based on a study that he did in 2017, almost half of the threats actually occur in elementary schools. And as you can see, the highest number of threats were actually made by 4th graders, and then the second highest by 5th graders. Males made more threats than females, and then we also have the demographic breakdown of different student groups who made the threats. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about types of threats. So to make the distinction between transient and substantive threats, it's helpful to recognize that threats lie on a continuum of severity. The lowest level of threat is a figure of speech with no intent to harm. And then from there, the level of threat increases to something much more serious with statements alluding to imminent violence. All right, I do have some handouts at the back table there that has copies of the transient threats versus substantive threats. If you haven't picked up a copy, so you're welcome to pick up a copy, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the differences between the two types. So transient threats are statements that do not express a lasting intent or harm. Typically, they're not genuine, they're not enduring. These types of threats are expressed during moments of anger or frustration, and they're really sometimes are intended as a joke or as a figure of speech. Typically, they're resolved pretty quickly on the scene, and the person who makes these types of threats usually end with some type of apology or retraction or clarification or explanation. Okay, so here are some examples, and I apologize, the copies I handed out did not come out very well, but these are some examples of types of transient threats. So as you can see, two people may be playing a game, things got heated, and one person may say to the other person, I'm going to get you, or I'm going to kill you. And it's not meant to really actually harm that person, It could be said out anger or frustration at the time, but upon investigation, the person explained that it was not meant to harm. People could be saying things like, I ought to shoot that teacher. Maybe they got a bad grade and they got angry and they said something like that, but later on apologize. Okay, so these are types of transient threats, and I won't go through all of them, but if there are ones that are in particular that you have questions about, we can talk about that a little bit later. Now, on the contrary, substantive threats are statements that express a continuing intent to harm someone. These types of threats are typically characterized by very specific pieces of information. So for example, you will see specific names of victims. You may see a specific time, a place, or a specific method that will be used to carry out that threat. Also, these types of threats are repeated over time or conveyed to other individuals. And then you also see that people who are planning to carry out these types of threats may spend a lot of time planning, recruiting other people to help them. There may be potential legal violations that require the police to get involved, and then also may require protective actions such as warning the intended victims and their families. So here are some examples of the substantive threats. The first one, I'll just go over a couple. It says, I'm going to blast Mr. Johnson with my pistol. Here, obviously, there's a very specific person in mind with a very specific method. Okay. And then next one, he's been telling everyone he's going to get you. So this goes back to what I had said earlier, is that it's repetitive, it's shared to other individuals, so it's indicative of this person who's been thinking about this for quite some time. Okay. And then you may also find evidence, physical evidence of the intent, such as some kind of list with names of victims, materials they're using to create some type of weapon, and so forth. All right, so we're going to do just a little fun quiz, just to kind of see how you would categorize these types of threats. So here I'm going to present 4 different threats that are common in the schools, and just for fun to see if you guys can categorize these as no threat, transient, or substantive. All right, so the first one, an angry student says, I'm going to kill you. And so the threat assessment team interviews the student, and he or she says that he or she does not really have any plan to harm the classmate. They just lost their temper and they apologized. So what do you all think? Is this no threat, transient, or substantive?
Transient.
And you're right. Very good. Excellent. It's transient. Goes back to what we had talked about earlier. It was said in the heat of the moment. They apologize and we move on. Okay. All right, let's look at the second one. This one says a student screams obscene insults at a teacher, then storms out of the classroom. On his way out or her way out, the student says the teacher isn't fair. What do you think about this one? No threat, transient, or substantive?
Not a threat.
Not a threat? Excellent, thank you. You're right. It is not a threat. It may appear to be a threat. However, the student never communicated an intent to harm here. He did say some things that were inappropriate. However, this is not considered a threat. And so for this particular situation, a threat assessment would not be appropriate. Depending on the school policy, they may implement some form of disciplinary action here, but it is not a threat. All right. So number 3, a student is reported to have a website containing threats to blow away several classmates. The student says the website is just a joke. He says that he has the right to free speech. The classmates say they are worried that he would do something to hurt them. What do you think about this one? we're all in agreement, as substantive. Clearly, there's an intent to harm. He even has a website, so that indicates that he's pretty serious. He's been spending some time thinking about this, putting time in to create this website. And the other piece that stuck out for me is that the classmates are clearly feeling threatened. Okay, so this would definitely be a very serious substantive threat. Last one, a student says a bully is threatening to beat him up after school at the bus stop. The accused student denies making a threat. You aren't sure who's telling the truth. So what do you think about this one? All right, so this has intent to harm, and because of that, it's considered to be substantive. And even though the person denies it, you're not really sure, so there's doubt there. And according to the Virginia guidelines, when there's doubt, you assume it's a threat and you proceed with a threat assessment. Okay? All right. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about who's going to be on the team. Now, a key component of the threat assessment process involves the creation of a multidisciplinary team, preferably one that is school-based for several reasons. First is it's a lot easier to build threat assessment as part of the school routine or disciplinary or safety plan. Also, it's important to have a school-based team so that they can respond to threats immediately. They're also more familiar with the school environment, student body, and staff. And of course, it's a lot easier to reach a consensus regarding the seriousness of the threat if you have the people there at the school. And then finally, it emphasizes monitoring students' interventions and support services and maintaining contact with the student. And unless you have a team at the school, this final step would not be possible. The team leader is typically responsible for receiving reports of threat at a lot of schools. This person may be an administrator, an assistant principal, or the principal who typically handles disciplinary issues. So once a threat is received, the team leader coordinates the process among team leaders, which would also include the school resource officer who would step in to conduct responsibilities and duties as a law enforcement officer. He may be called upon for non-emergency and emergency situations and to also participate in preventative efforts. The team may also include school counselors, social workers, if there's one at that school. Typically, teachers and paraprofessionals are not asked to serve on the team because they have ongoing classroom responsibilities, which would make them not as available. However, if they are willing to serve, it would definitely be a benefit or an advantage for that team, as they can help identify threatening behaviors that they're seeing in the classrooms, in the hallways, and so forth, and would be able to share concerns that would warrant attention. And then, of course, the school psychologist would play a central role in certain aspects of threat assessment, given the training and experience school psychologists have in working with diverse student populations, developing interventions, and doing assessment. They may be tasked with conducting mental health evaluations of students to gather information about motives and so forth. All right, so we've already talked a lot about what threat assessment is. I do want to emphasize the main components of threat assessment, and those are the identification of the threat. Once the threats are identified, we want to evaluate how serious that threat is and whether it poses as a danger to others. And then interventions should be provided to reduce the risk of violence for that particular student who made the threats, and then follow up to assess intervention results. Threat assessment in the schools is predicated on 6 principles which were articulated by the U.S. Secret Service and the U.S. Department of Education. Now, for the sake of time, I'm only going to highlight the main points. So these principles are really the foundation for building threat assessment. And the first one is that prevention is possible. Second is that we always want to consider the context and the circumstance looking at that student very comprehensively. And then third is to adopt an investigative and critical mindset. We want to rely on evidence, facts. We don't want to rely on profiles. Fifth principle is to utilize multiple sources. And in addition to interviewing teachers, other students, peers, and so forth, we want to also talk to family members, professionals that they may be working with outside of the school. And then finally, we want to focus on whether that student is on the path towards violence. We don't really want to focus on the act of making threats because a lot of students make threats all the time, and it doesn't mean that they will actually follow through with it. So once a threat is received, the team leader coordinates the process among team members, and then the threat assessment process begins. And here, Dr. Cornell presents the 5 steps in the form of a decision tree that guides the team through every decision point with paths to follow based on yes or no answers at each step. And I do have that handout in the back for you all. Again, I'm not going to go through all the steps, but I do want to emphasize that it's a very systematic, methodical guide to do the threat assessment process. So the first step is, of course, to look at the threat, evaluate it, and then based on how the team answers a question, if it's yes and we need to proceed, then we would try to resolve the threat as transient. Within the step 2, there are other questions to answer, and if it's not a transient threat, we have to step it up to the next level. Then we go to step 3, and we will treat that as a substantive threat. Within step 3, as you can see, there are other bullet items that they need to follow through, and then that would take them to step 4. And if they need to, they would conduct a mental health evaluation, create some sort of safety plan, and treat this as a very serious substantive threat. They may involve law enforcement and so forth. And then finally, they will implement and then monitor the safety plan or monitor services for that particular student. All right, so just quickly, I want to address some limitations here. Threat assessment is, and I do want to make sure that we're clear that it's not really designed to predict violence. Threat assessment is really designed to identify potential violence, and that the general guidelines that they provide don't always encompass all the threats under every circumstance within all different contexts. And threat assessment is really only one part of a school safety program. Other key pieces, of course, would be consistent, fair disciplinary policy, strong counseling psych services, anti-bullying, conflict resolution, restorative practice programs, and then, of course, supervision from teachers, administrators, and so forth. And in order for threat assessment to be successful, we would need a staff who's trained, knowledgeable, willing, and dedicated to create a climate of trust and communication among all. Oops. All right, so just really quickly, I do want to say that it is threat assessment is considered to be evidence-based, and they've done a ton of research studies to show that. There are several threat assessment models out there, but the Virginia guidelines are considered evidence-based, and through a series of control studies, they were able to find no disparities among Black, Hispanic, Latinx, and white students in out-of-school suspensions, school transfers, or legal actions. Students in special education were not disproportionately suspended. They also found that this process that's been implemented in schools that really have committed to this process, they were able to find lower suspension rates because it disrupts the typical disciplinary process, and it gives the school time to evaluate the intention behind the threats. And so a lot of times, just having that process in place, they were able to find out that this really particular situation doesn't warrant suspension, and so they were able to actually keep their suspension numbers down. And then finally, in schools where threat assessments practiced, students and teachers reported more favorable perceptions of school climate because the guidelines aligns with restorative practices in regard to school discipline and ultimately lead to a decline in student aggression. And after all, this is the goal for any school, is to enhance the sense of positive school climate and school safety. Thank you for your attention. Now turning it over to Holly, who will talk about safety measures.
Thank you, Lynn. So, well, Lynn just talked about threat assessment and what that can look like in the context of a school. I'm going to discuss some additional safety measures that schools use to prevent and prepare for threats. So, while there are a lot of different measures, the three I'm going to talk about today are metal detectors, school safety drills, and the presence of school resource officers. So first, there are quite a few studies on the use of metal detectors in schools and what that means for students and school safety. And most studies did find that, yes, metal detectors do their job of decreasing weapon carrying in the schools, but they didn't have too much of an impact on student victimization or drug presence at the school studied. It also showed that metal detectors did have some negative implications for school climate, particularly in more urban areas. Essentially that, having a student walk through a metal detector every single morning kind of has the underlying message that they're either a source of violence or they could be a target of violence. So yes, they can help make schools safer in a way, but in regard to school climate, they can be a little detrimental. The National Association of Secondary School Principals put out this statement in 2019 stating that trusting relationships and a positive school climate are the most effective means of ensuring school safety, much more so than metal detectors. Next, I just wanted to touch on the presence of school resource officers, or for the purpose of this presentation, I'll refer to them as SROs. And the National Center on Education Statistics defines an SRO as a career law enforcement officer who is assigned by the employing police department to work in collaboration with the school and the community. And so in schools, yes, SROs act as law enforcers, but they can also act as teachers, mentors, and kind of check in, check out people for students. A recent study in 2018 looked at the different degrees of requirements that SROs have to obtain to work in schools. And Pennsylvania and Arizona were the states that required their school resource officers to be a part of an MOU or MOA, which is essentially just a document that defines, what the roles and expectations of an SRO will be. The resource officers also have to participate in data-driven evaluation. So just like teachers have to participate in TEKS, administrators, leaks, so do school resource officers. Police officer, they have to complete police officer certification training, as well as an additional training for school resource officer training as well. So the study then looked at, in general, states across the nation and what their requirements for resource officers were. And 8 states listed below withheld 3 of the 4 requirements that we just talked about. 8 other states upheld half of those recommendations, and then a dozen states, including Georgia, only met 1 recommendation, which was that they needed to be a certified police officer. So the findings from that study, or the takeaways, were that while SROs, yes, are trained officers, they might benefit from more training on how to work in school environments with students and how to collaborate with educators and administrators. And in response to the high number of school shootings, the NASRO put out a statement that school resource officers are not a hired gun, and that the goal of an SRO is to bridge the gap between law enforcement and students and to build a relationship with those students. So they're more as prevention, not just there to stop a bad situation after it's already happening. And then the last measure I want to talk about is school safety drills. So in states like South Carolina, Georgia, the schools do have to have active intruder drills once a semester. However, practices across the nation have been critiqued just for different methods and their effect on students and parents and teachers. So an article published in 2019 looked at all different kind of ways that school safety drills are conducted at all different grades and schools. And essentially they found, especially with elementary schools, that we are expecting school children to act like small adults. And their statement and reasoning behind that was because, after being told by adults that, children are told they're not capable of handling little challenges like putting away their backpack and making their lunch choice, their teachers or same adults are then requiring them to handle a big challenge like, a school shooter drill, which can be, pretty intense and scary for little kids. An additional study conducted in 2016 on student play, school violence, and school lockdowns found that students wanted more discussions about how to handle emotions associated with drills, but they also found that teachers wanted more professional development regarding how to speak with students on this topic. Most teachers, have classes, but most don't have, much less a classroom management class, but a class on how to talk to students about really intense situations like school safety. And I have a handout that was in the back as the next handout about how to speak with children about violence, tips for teachers and parents, but it's really a great resource for anyone on how to speak with kids about these different kinds of situations. And we'll dive a little deeper into that handout in a moment. So NASP and the NASRO collaborated and created a list of recommendations for drills that take into account the developmental and mental health of students. And while this is a very brief overview, it did list that effective drills should result in staff who inspire calm and confidence in students. That drills should be developmentally appropriate, which we'll also talk about what that means in a minute. And school-employed mental health professionals like counselors and school psychologists should be involved in preparing for the drills. And it was also recommended that students have parental consent before participating in these drills. So what are the implications for educators? I want to talk about how teachers can become more prepared to discuss topics around school safety and school violence with their students, how parents can become more prepared, and also how they can speak about it with their fellow educators. So one really great resource is the National Education Association, and they have a school crisis guide that is just one of many of their resources for helping children cope with traumatic events. And their crisis guide breaks down essentially how to prevent a school crisis, prepare for one, respond, and recover for one. And we'll look more at just the prevention piece today since we're more focusing on threat assessment. But two other organizations that also have great resources and handouts just for how to speak with children about really intense and traumatic events are also the National Child Traumatic Stress Network and the American Academy of Pediatrics as well. So the NEA School Crisis Guide, their prevention model looks at or really emphasizes promoting a positive school climate. And when I say building a positive school climate, this is their safe and supportive schools model. They really focus in on engagement, safety, and environment. Engagement meaning how are students welcomed into the school, how do they treat others, do they want to come to school every single day. Safety involves, do children feel physically safe? What does drug use look like in the school, and how can that be prevented? And also, do children feel emotionally safe? Do they feel as though they have someone to talk to in their schools? And then lastly, environment. So is the physical environment welcoming? Is the academic environment welcoming? Do the students feel like they can grow and learn and are supported by their teachers and classmates? And then of course the disciplinary environment. Do the children feel like it's a fair and it's an effective process, as well as the educators as well. So talking more about positive and preventative school discipline, it's recommended that schools practice positive discipline where students do feel respected and reported and supported. So one thing that they highly recommend is the use of restorative practices. To me, that was a very general term, so I wanted to dig into what that meant. And restorative practices essentially are just school expectations that encourage students and staff to create a positive and connective and orderly school environment. So part of that is having and regularly meeting with a school safety team, which one just went over all of the benefits of having one of those. Also implementing positive behavior supports and interventions. So whether that's a full PBIS curriculum or just pieces of it, it's been shown to have a positive effect on schools. And also to create an environment that allows students to practice social emotional learning and to grow in that way as well. And this handout just looks at, it's the handout that you actually have. It's just the bullet points that go over, how do you talk to kids about violence? Every child is different, so every child's going to react differently. But the piece I really wanted to hone in on was keeping your explanations developmentally appropriate. That can be a very general term. And so NASA does a really great job at breaking it down into different age groups. And so for early elementary school, keeping information brief and simple and just reassuring them that they're safe is most important for the younger ones. But for that upper elementary, early middle school, they might be really confused and scared. So for them, it would be more being prepared to answer their questions and making sure that they know all the facts about what happened. For upper, middle, and high school, they are developing, they're much more mature, and so they're probably going to have really strong opinions about what happened, whatever kind of situation it was at school. And for them, it's really important to emphasize, of course, that they're safe, but also that they play a very large role in making their school a safe place. And so different ways that educators can advocate for their schools to practice best safety practices include advocating for a school safety team. If your school does have one, making sure you know who is on it, what's their role, if you could be on it, all of those different questions. But if the school doesn't have one, see if there is a crisis plan or a team assigned for when a crisis arises. And of course, consider advocating for a team to be built to include the following people that one described earlier. Secondly, it's important that teachers know and other educators that they can consider working with school mental health professionals like psychologists, counselors, and social workers. They're able to provide direct therapeutic services to students through individual or group counseling. They can do psychological assessments of social emotional functioning and behavior. They can consult regularly to make sure interventions are put in place and that those interventions are effective. They also can help with suicide intervention and postvention, as well as crisis intervention, and can be a key player in crisis response teams. And lastly, teachers can advocate to have professional development, whether that be in building resiliency skills or building up better social emotional skills in children. They can also find out if they can receive further education on student mental health to better understand the children in their classroom. And of course, they can ask for just more protocols for how to respond to bullying in their schools to help keep their students more safe. So we'd like to close just with this final thought from the NAS Director of Communications, that Any act of school violence is unacceptable, and so is failing to act with clarity and diligence on the lessons learned from so many tragedies and owned by the work of educators across the country. The challenge for school leaders and mental health professionals is to work together to put that knowledge into practice. So that is our presentation, and now we wanted to see if you had any question, unless you would like to do the video.
If you're more interested, we do have time. Question?
I have a question. I have to put my question in context, though, because it's important that you know this. On May the 20th, 1999, I got a phone call that no parent ever wants to get, and that there was a shooting in your son's high school. You didn't mention it, but right here at Heritage High School in Rockdale County, on May the 20th, 1999, a young man, 15 years old, walked into the school and shot 6 students. Fortunately, they all survived. But the young man was not the kind of person that you described. He wasn't mentally ill, didn't have any emotional problems. In fact, he was a scout in my son's scout group. So my question is, now it's 20 years later, the number of school shootings has escalated, hasn't declined. If we're sitting here 5 years from now and we found the answer, what is it? And I'll put it in a different context. We tried the metal detectors. I've been in schools all over the city of Atlanta. Most of them don't work, and they certainly don't decrease the number of weapons that go into the schools. The school resource officers that APS employs are, in my observation, are the biggest, baddest looking guys you ever want to see. I mean, they're twice my size, and they have all these weapons and on their utility belts, right? Stun guns and whatever is on their utility belts. So they're just bad looking people, so nobody wants to mess with them, right? But still we see violence on the increase. So what's the answer? We're sitting here 5 years from now and we found the answer based on all of this 20 years of research. What's the answer?
So I think part of the answer, which was presented here, is having a systematic, effective approach to threat assessment and having that be a part of what's going on. And I think part of what we were trying to say is that it's not necessarily somebody with a mental health problem, but it's looking at the instances of threat and then responding to those appropriately, and emphasizing climate.
In the threat assessment group, there's a key group I didn't see included. Maybe I missed it, but those are the students themselves, right? And I didn't see that on whoever is advising this group. But here's the problem with that, and you know this as well as I do. No student is going to be in that group. No student is going to raise their hand and say, I'm going to be part of that. Why? Because they'll be labeled a snitch. And no student in any high school, in any middle school, maybe in elementary school, they might raise their hand, but certainly in middle school and high school, they're not going to raise their hand and say, hey, I want to be on the threat assessment team, because they're going to be given a label.
The students are not on the threat assessment team, but they are part of the process of the threat assessment procedure. So, for example, if they followed through the procedure and felt like they needed to conduct a threat assessment, part of the threat assessment is conducting interviews and talking to students who know about the situation, who may be part of the situation, who may know the person who made the threat, as part of the comprehensive process of gathering evidence and facts. So students aren't necessarily starting on the team, but they are part of the process.
And there's been legal issues why they can't be on the team. So, sharing of information, confidentiality. And that's often why parents are included in only parts of that process because of the type of information that's being shared. So their involvement would have to be, in different ways as opposed to assessing a situation or assessment. But I think your question is great, because I think we've been struggling with this a long time, and I think part of the message is it's multi-pronged, right? So it's not this Band-Aid, it's not that Band-Aid. I do think it's gun policies. I do think it's multi-tiered, from a societal, political perspective all the way down to our school buildings, and we know our school buildings look like what the society looks like. So as we've seen politically, there's been more bullying, and that level we see an increase in bullying in school buildings. So our kids are doing what the adults are doing around them, and so I think all of these are part of the puzzle, and so there's been a call for increased mental health professionals, but no one wants to fund it, and so there's been an increase in school resource officers, but many of them are not trained to work with kids. They're police officers who are retired, who are now being put in buildings like in North Carolina. There's been a new law that allows us to do that, but they're not trained on how to work with kids. So it's just putting, like we said, a gun in a building, and we know that doesn't help, right? So like we're doing these things that are reactive instead of, I think, stepping back and looking at kind of all the different levels of problems that we're having, and then figuring out how to do that systemically and systematically, as opposed to a crisis pops up and we address that, and then we kind of push that down, and then something else pops up. I think schools are still the safest place for kids, and I hope we emphasize that. It's safer for them than being not going to school. I think it's important for us to be aware of school violence and school perpetration and what that looks like. The numbers are still going down. If you look at school violence in schools, even though the media attention is around shootings and what those look like. So, but I think it's complicated, and these answers keep coming back to answers we were doing 20 years ago, right, in schools. So, but I do think it's like that one thing, not putting them all together. It's been problematic.
I also think, again, it's a great question, and I think one of the things that I'm learning is that what I hope would be different 5 years from now is that we would be able to study these kinds of things systematically. I think the presentation touched on the restrictions, around national resources for studying gun violence generally, and that would certainly extend to school violence as well. And I think, I'll speak from my professional life. I haven't been a strong political advocate, but the longer I'm in the profession, the more interested I am in political advocacy. And so I would hope 5 years from now we would have some resources to study these things, because it's complicated and there aren't easy answers. And so we keep trying things. And as you said, there's all the things that we try, there's always that situation that doesn't fit, that doesn't necessarily, respond to whatever the effort is that's been implemented. So I would hope 5 years from now we would have more data and more information.
Actually, I hope we have less. However, what we have, we can study.
So. Another question. You kind of talked about it, but I think you talked about it more in negative terms than in positive terms. I'm not a gun advocate. My son, who works in law enforcement, carries a weapon 24 hours a day. Believe it or not, it's right next to his bed because he has to, right? So he's in law enforcement. He works for one of the alphabets that you mentioned. He's an FBI agent, and so his weapon is like an extension of his hand, right? He took me to the gun range one time, and my hand was going like this when I picked up the weapon. I shot it one time, put it down, and said, "Okay, that's enough for me." But my question is about having armed teachers. The first reaction was from teachers, "I'm not going to carry a weapon. My job is to teach, not to protect children with a weapon." Right? I don't know of any state that was considering legislation that was suggesting that every teacher was going to be armed. It was those who were trained, those who wanted to be armed, could be armed. Do I have that right or wrong?
Yes, that's correct.
Have that right.
However, they did mandate a number of teachers in the building should be carrying
No, yeah, I know there's technicalities, but the point is that not every teacher was told they had to carry a weapon, and that was what was in the media. So we fast forward to this year, 2019, when there's a shooting in a church, and 5 people who were in the church were carrying a concealed weapon and killed the perpetrator before he was able to shoot more than the 2 people that he did shoot. So on the other side of that, the argument is, well, yeah, maybe we all should be carrying a weapon. That might minimize everything.
Those 5 people, that was an organized, so that, okay, the more that came out about that particular incident, because I just happened to be in Texas during that time, is that that church is now being held up as a model for implementing safety in religious settings, because they actually have a committee, they have a small group of people who were on that committee who walked through how they would handle situations, who were all willing to be the people in the sanctuary who had guns and would step in if something horrible happened. And that's exactly what they did. So
Right.
it's a really strange way of thinking about it. And
Well, I don't know if it's strange or weird, because that model that you say is being held up as a national model, it worked. Presumably, that guy would have killed more than 2 people if he hadn't been shot himself. I wonder if you take that same model and put it in a school, where you have maybe half the teachers are armed, or 5 teachers are armed.
you know, just on the surface of it, again, I just think we need to systematically, as Dr. Burgess was saying, look at these issues. One of the, if you will, one of the advantages those 5 people had in that particular situation is that it was in one large sanctuary and they were all there. And so one of the challenges for school-based situations is that you have all these little pods of people. You don't have, so even if you had a small group of people who were like your son, for whom they were well trained and a gun's an extension of their arm and their duty is to protect. Even if you had that small group of people, they're not necessarily going to be able to quickly be activated where they need to be in the same way that I think in this other kind of setting it was possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just for the record, I'm not a gun advocate. I'm not suggesting that teachers be armed, but I think it's something to look at.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So we have these 2 wonderful videos about the pros and cons that are very short around carrying or not carrying from teachers' perspectives. So it's a nice segue. And your argument is what people that want guns in schools are using. Like, if there's guns in schools, can they prevent and or stop an incident? And that's the argument that's been used.
While they're setting it up, I will add that it's, I think, very dangerous.
The idea.
Why should teachers be armed? I mean, it's a way. I guess the really basic question a lot of people are asking, why should teachers be armed?
Teachers in the classroom, they're always the ones that are going to be first to respond. Why not give them something to fight back with?
To fight back, Carl Donaldson is armed with a 9mm Glock handgun.
Where is your firearm?
Can I show it to you?
Yes, please. And your cowboy boot?
So I wear boots.
You didn't used to wear boots?
No.
Is this gun loaded?
There's nothing in the chamber. The school board would not allow for us to put one in the chamber.
So it's never loaded in class?
It's in the clip.
Would it be more effective to have a loaded gun?
Yes, that's a concern. Absolutely, especially if they come after me. And they get in faster training. They teach us how to fight them off and then get to your weapon.
FASTER is a 3-day course that trains teachers like Donaldson in firearms and trauma response and includes a simulated school shooting scenario.
I went through the simulated school shooting training and my heart rate was up here. Do you think in that split second, in the worst case scenario, you could make the decision and identify a shooter?
You know, that's the question. You know, we do all the training in the world. I don't know if you're going to be able to perform when it comes time.
So many schools across the country are debating whether arming teachers is the best way to keep students safe. We sat down with a few other teachers here during their lunch break having that same discussion.
I had really mixed feelings when they first came up with it. It was very saddening to me that that's what this has come to. And I think the biggest thing that helped me with it was knowing what the training was or would be for the staff that were interested.
Do you think arming teachers is the right response to these school shootings?
I don't know if there is a right response, to be real honest. I think it's at least a step to hopefully help, you know, deter. Our number one priority is the safety of our children, and this is a step hopefully in the right direction.
With armed staff, do you feel safer? Do you feel your students are safer?
I do. I do too. I do.
So, and then we have one against.
I want to Meyers about, walk us through. You are exactly the type of person the president says should be armed to protect our kids. You're a former Marine, you're a teacher, you understand both. What do you think of his idea?
I think it's a horrible idea for two basic reasons: competency and trust. When I was a Marine, I trained 52 weeks a year to be combat ready. Teachers don't have that luxury. I simply cannot train enough and teach full time to be combat ready. And the second one is trust. As a Marine, I had complete trust in my chain of command to have my back, no matter what happened in the line of duty. I don't trust the Florida legislature or the Florida governor to have my back in a crisis.
Do you think your fellow school teachers, if they were trained, it would help the school? Would it keep the students safer?
No, I don't believe it would. Now, of course, there may always be that one-off situation where an armed individual can save a life. But for the majority of us, and for the majority, the large parts of students, I don't believe that arming teachers will make them significantly safer. If President Trump wants to really help, if Governor Scott wants to help, give my school district the money to put an armed professional law enforcement officer on every campus from pre-K to adult education. That would help.
Do you
Your opinions.
You want to finish your?
Thanks, Joel. Well, I think what, and you all mentioned this within the presentation, I think we also have to think about the systems in which we're working and the biases with which every educator is working with, and that will impact how they're using the weapon, who they would use the weapon on, when they would discharge it, and I think that until we fix some of these other systemic problems in regards to relations and climate and interactions and respect and appreciation and so forth of one another across all of these contexts, we should not add a gun and create the additional access for that. And I just can't imagine, I mean I can, but incorporating, because I've taught you referenced the classroom management courses. I've taught the classroom management courses. I've talked about school safety. We've talked about the partnerships that need to be developed and that type of thing. But what I don't want to make time for is how to use a gun training seminars and that type of thing. I think I would rather focus on identity and intersectionality and cultural biases and that type of thing, and how we can combat that and develop a more positive school learning environment than how to hide a gun in a cowboy boot.
Question kind of following up on that.
So I know early in the presentation it said there's protocol for getting parental consent for a child to participate in the shooting drills, right? And the whole trauma behind that, I think it's just crazy. But what about, let's say that legislation passes and the teacher can carry a firearm in the school from a parental perspective. Is there some sort of notification that says there is a person that is in the school, maybe even in your classroom, that has a gun, to give a fair warning to the parent? That way, if they want to make a decision if they want to keep their child in the school, or is that kept separate? And the follow-up to that is, if that information is released, does that not then become a potential security hazard to where if I'm somebody that's thinking about doing something, and I know Mr. Johnson in room 115 has a gun, I'm not going to go there, I'm going to start somewhere else. So I'm just kind of curious about like what are the protocols, because I think everybody's talking about this is a multifaceted problem. Yeah. We got to really think through this. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with one particular stance, but it's highly complex. And I'm a new parent, my daughter's 2, and these are things, that's why I came to this, because I'm sitting here thinking like, I don't even know if I want to put my, I know schools are safe, but if we have people that are making these policies and decisions that aren't asking the same types of questions and thinking this through, that's highly problematic for me. Because I know if I'm a parent and I have cousins and I have nephews and nieces in schools and I have, friends in schools, and you're not, if someone's in a classroom that's not trained, I agree, and you don't tell me, and I'm a parent or a guardian, I have a problem with that. I think, so I'm just curious, do you have any information about for any of the schools that are allowing that? Is that information communicated, and then in what way, and what measures are have been taking place to not leak that information, or who's given access to that information?
Yeah.
Really good question. I don't think we know.
No. So we are teachers can carry in Georgia, and I am unaware of any notification for lots of reasons about who is carrying and who isn't. I don't know if they're mandated to do that. I mean, it's a great question. I've not, from all the work I've done, never heard that anyone was sending out letters saying we have teachers who are carrying. But we can definitely follow up to find out if there is a school.
And I don't, unless you guys know, I don't know if schools where parents are asked for permission at their need to participate in drills. That's a recommendation.
It's a recommendation, but it's not like a protocol. It's not a policy.
I'm not aware of that being done. Yeah.
You had a slide up there that had a wide variety of signs that indicated that these schools had teachers in them that carried weapons. Aren't they like models we can look at and say, okay, how do you go? How do you go about notifying parents, or do you notify parents, or is it a concealed weapon because it is concealed? You know what I'm saying? I mean, I share the same thoughts that you have, but I keep coming back to this idea that not every teacher is going to carry a weapon, and that they have to meet, as far as I know, I'm not an expert, but as far as I know, they have to meet certain criteria. You have to be trained, they have to have a license, and in order to have a license, you have a background, all that kind of stuff. So I'm not as concerned. Of course, I don't have a 2-year-old. Mine are 39 and 35. But I have grandchildren, one who is in middle school this year. And so I'm concerned about them. But I asked a question about, 5 years from now, if we have the answer. If I had the answer, I'd be the first one in my grandchild's school saying this is the answer. I don't know what it is. It scares me. It really does scare me.
And to your point about, what is it turning into? Because I'm writing notes about, we're seeing recommendations from the federal, like FBI and Secret Service, and this is now affecting protocol for within a school environment. Mm-hmm. So what are we transitioning into? This is a place of learning, but and I'm not, like I said, I understand the context, and you want to make a response, but at the same time, it's like, are we in a watershed sort of position to where this then just becomes the norm? And it's, you're an educator, but you're also a profiler, and you have to teach, but at the same time, you know what I mean? Like, because the threat assessment, like that sort of protocol comes from people trained in this sort of background, and so, and again, like, as an educator, I mean, I've worked in classrooms for over a decade. Like, I want to focus on teaching, curriculum design, all that sort of stuff, evaluation. I don't want to think about, and I understand, like you said, it's not everyone, but even 3 people. Because that's 3 people now that you can't have your focus 100% on what your primary responsibility is. So even if it's 10% or 15%, how many children does that equate to that you're then sort of diverting your attention, which, with all due respect, is important, safety, but then, you're compromising execution of pedagogy and all these other, nuanced parts of education, right? So I don't know. I'm just kind of concerned about that as well. Like, what are we moving towards? I'm sorry. This is a great presentation. I don't expect that you have the answers.
No. I think they're really good questions to really think about, because I think a lot of times we make these sweeping policies that we think is going to fix everything, and there's a lot of nuances that do occur in the schools, and every school is different. Every teacher reacts differently, and it's different student populations. I think these are really important things to think about. And just to address your concern regarding bringing in the Secret Service and FBI, and I know that sounds really harsh, but I think right now, like, I did some research on my district, looking at disciplinary data and looking at disciplinary actions, and how did schools react to students who had different disciplinary issues. And I looked at numbers for elementary, middle, and high, and and I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head, but even at the elementary school level, like 800-900 suspensions a year, and then it goes up even from there all the way up to high school. And it seems like there's so many kids that are being suspended, expelled, and those are the kids that, over time, the same kids are being expelled or suspended, and over time, they're losing education. And those are the kids that really should be in school. And sometimes they're suspended for things that, if school had taken the time to talk to these students, ask questions, investigate it a little bit deeper to find out that maybe there are issues at home that's happening that's causing them to react a certain way in schools. And suspending them only fixes the problem for 2 days, but the problem is never addressed. And so they come back and that problem comes right back with them. So I think part of threat assessment is to give kids a say in why they behaved the way they behaved. Are there other root causes that are underlying that we need to address, so that we're actually getting to the heart of the problem and not just putting them out of school for 2 days and hopefully that will fix it. Because a lot of times these kids go home, they're going home to an empty house, their parents have to work, they're sitting at home playing video games. What is that teaching them? It's not teaching them anything. So that's why threat assessment is becoming something that they're looking at as a way to incorporate restorative practices into the schools, and not always takes kids out of the schools, but keeping them in the schools and then providing services that are needed for those kids. So.
I have one final question, I'm sorry. Is there, so as you move from, transient to substantive and very substantive, and I'm assuming there's some documentation that happens, like, once you get past a certain threshold. And I know a student that has something, you're not supposed to profile and say, okay, like, that carries a mark on them. But have you heard any talks about, like, let's say a student had something that was reported as seriously substantive, nothing was acted upon, they transition out of K-12. Let's say they graduate, they go to college. Is there some sort of communication that happens to the next institution they travel to? I mean, I know as far as, like, when they were talking about the database for individuals that are mentally ill, and sort of trying to track that and discourage, like, the ability to get a gun, right? Do we have the equivalent, or are they talking about the equivalent for some of the students? And then what are the implications with that? Because it could be a benefit, but it could also be a thing that marks you, right?
Right.
Just like SAT scores, it's like you didn't make the mark, it's on your transcript, you go to the college, and all of a sudden, it's factored into, because I'm in admissions, we we look through the applications and there's questions on there about, you know, did you have any sort of prior infraction at the previous school? And we got to go through a whole dean of students process. So I'm just kind of thinking through like what happens. What happens to the people that, let's say it was something and it's just like you've moved past that. You know, are they talking about like this documentation traveling with someone and what that could mean? Are we thinking through that type of?
It doesn't, and then the question on the admissions is actually self-report.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So it's self-report whether you've had a disciplinary action, and then you can defend that.
Right.
You know, we've also, now with credentialing, when students have had, we had a really great case of we had a case of a student who was a minor who had made some decisions, and then as an older adult came back to school and then wasn't able to be credentialed, even though that was 20 years ago and had done all this work to get to a different place, and then wasn't able to get a certificate. So I think those things do catch up, because if they get involved legally, if there isn't a record from a legal perspective, it's just discipline things from school to school, it may not follow if the adults don't connect those files together. And they might not do that on purpose, right? So we can't get a file from that school because they want a new start here and don't want that file to follow them, and what that looks like. But there's been questions around legal responsibility for people who knew about past behaviors that didn't do the things they needed to do and then ended up in future violence. And so that's a really slippery slope for psychologists and psychiatrists. And now if we're putting educators in that role of being able to predict violence. So what we know around predicting future violence or harm, psychologists and psychiatrists are right about 1/3 of the time. And so that to me is, you know, if you're talking about the experts, and predicting future violence or harm is really incredibly difficult. So it's kind of, they equate it to legal shaking the 8 ball. Remember, all of us old enough to remember the magic 8 ball, shaking it and going, oh, maybe. No, you know, and that's what they predict that's what they say is the equivalent of us being able to predict harm in the future. So it's really, really scary to me when there's laws that could hold us accountable for that.
That's really scary.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why it's scary, because in the threat assessment steps, in step 3, that's where the decision was made. Yeah. And if they're wrong 2/3 of the time, okay, if something does or doesn't happen, at that point, who's liable? I don't want to say forget what happens after that, but at step 3, if they go in one direction versus another and they're wrong,
right,
who's liable?
So over-predicting is always something that they would rather have people do, and there's laws to protect those professionals who do that. So you have to suspect harm or suspect future harm, not necessarily be right based on some of the protections, but it depends on your state. So there's some states that can connect. So you've seen some of the college shootings where they go back to a history of seeing a psychologist or psychiatrist, and you know, there was, you know, some treatment, but it wasn't followed up with, and whether they're responsible or not. So there's some court cases that I think people are following closely to take a look at those issues. And it does depend on law, and basically goes back to this law around Tarasoft, around duty to warn, duty to protect, and protection around future harm. And it varies significantly.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a teacher and I was asked to be on the threat assessment team,
yep,
and I knew part of an important part of that was the school psychologist, and if I knew that he or she was going to be wrong 2/3 of the time, and the potential.
Yeah, no, that's physical, that's future harm. Yeah.
Yeah. So if something does happen, right, and then an attorney comes back and says, hey, you know, on step 3. You guys assessed this threat, and you said there was no threat, and I was part of the threat assessment team, likely I'm going to get sued, right? By whoever the victims were, right? So who would volunteer to be on the threat assessment team? Those are not good odds.
Yeah, and those are, again, I think different types of violence, we're better at predicting what that looks like, you know, and so it would range on the type of violence, what that looks like. And I think for threat assessment, we're looking at intervening to prevent harm.
And I don't know that there are data about the accuracy of threat assessment procedure, like the Cornell model of that. I think you were talking about other kinds of research about psychologists. So what's good about this is you're focusing on the actual behaviors of the kids and doing it systematically. One of the things I wanted to say is a lot of the presentation had implications for, and actually the questions that you guys have been raising have implications for school climate. And I'm just mentioning that Gary McGivney is going to be here in March talking about school climate. It's just like some of the questions you were raising and that you were raising, those would be great to raise with Gary McGivney, who's high up in the state ed department here, and it would be interesting to hear what he has to say from his perspective, from that spot.
And I will go back to, so one of the reasons why people are concerned about whether they do like suicidal screening around suicidal ideations or behaviors is once you identify a student, what do you do with that student? And so if you identify lots of students, you have the resources to follow up. And so there's concerns about what do you do once you have information? And then whether you do something or don't do something, what's your legal responsibility? What's your liability around those things? And so there is legal responsibility, liability potentially for individuals, which is why we recommend things like professional liability insurance and different types of ways to protect yourself in schools, because you are making decisions that have educational as well as social, emotional, behavioral impact on kids. And over-reporting does do harm to kids, so if we over-report, then people might be concerned about a child, and what are the implications for that child, so we might over-report and feel like we've reduced our liability, or feel like, we've prevented something that may have happened, and now we have a child who's been identified as a potential threat in some way. So there are pros and cons to how we handle those, and that's why it goes back to who's on that threat assessment team around the confidentiality of information and how do we handle that, and who needs to know and who should know, and there's lots of things we need to think through, which goes back to what you said originally.
So I'm sure we're past our time. Thank you all for hanging in.
Thank you.